John Denver checked the fuel gauge twice before climbing into the cockpit. His hands moved across the instrument panel with the kind of muscle memory that comes from logging 2,700 hours in the air. Not the careful, deliberate movements of an amateur. The confident touch of someone who'd been flying since he was 25 years old. Most people knew him for Take Me Home, Country Roads, or Rocky Mountain High. The guy with the round glasses and acoustic guitar who sang about sunshine and mountains. What they didn't know was that Denver had been obsessed with aviation longer than he'd been famous. He'd earned his pilot's license in 1967, back when he was still Henry John Deutschendorf Jr., before the stage name, before the Grammy nominations, before any of it mattered. By the mid-90s, though, things had changed. The record sales had dried up. Radio stations weren't playing his music anymore. Denver was 53 years old, and the world had moved on to grunge and hip-hop and electronic beats that had nothing to do with folk songs about nature. But he hadn't stopped working. He'd just shifted his focus. Environmental activism became his new stage. He testified before Congress about wilderness protection, spoke at rallies against offshore oil drilling, made himself very visible and very vocal about corporate exploitation of natural resources. Some people didn't appreciate that. Denver started mentioning it to friends in 1996. Pressure. Strange phone calls. Letters that weren't quite threats but felt like warnings. His ex-wife Cassandra later told reporters he'd seemed on edge those final months. Not scared exactly. More like someone who knew he'd crossed a line but refused to step back. Then there was the Long-EZ. Denver bought the experimental aircraft in July of 1997, 3 months before the accident. It was a home-built kit plane, the kind aviation enthusiasts assemble in their garages over years. Lightweight composite construction, pusher propeller mounted behind the cockpit, fuel tanks in the wings. The previous owner had configured it with an unusual fuel selector valve positioned behind the pilot's left shoulder. You had to reach back and twist it to switch between tanks. Awkward placement. Dangerous even, for someone flying solo. Denver's friend Marcus, a private pilot who'd flown with him dozens of times, asked him about it in September. They were standing in the hangar at Monterey Peninsula Airport, looking at the Long-EZ. Marcus ran his hand along the fuselage. "Why this plane?" he said. "You've got the money for something certified, something normal." Denver smiled. That distant smile he'd been wearing a lot lately. "Normal's boring," he said. "Besides, I want to understand how these things really work, from the ground up." Marcus didn't push it, but he thought about that conversation later. Thought about how Denver had been taking more risks that year. Flying in weather he used to avoid, staying up later, drinking more. Living like someone who'd made peace with something, or maybe someone who'd decided consequences didn't matter anymore. Travis, the mechanic who did the pre-flight inspection on October 10th, noticed something else. He was checking the fuel system when he saw scratches around the selector valve housing. Fresh scratches. Like someone had been working on it recently. He mentioned it to Denver. "You have somebody else look at this?" Travis said. Denver shook his head. "Just me. Been trying to figure out how to reposition it. Make it easier to reach." Travis wrote it in his notes. "Modifications not completed. Recommend professional installation before extended flight." Denver signed off on the inspection report. He'd deal with it later, he said. After the weekend. 2 days later, he'd be dead. And those scratches around the fuel valve would become the center of a debate that still hasn't ended. Was John Denver a careless pilot who made a fatal mistake? Or was he a man who'd angered the wrong people, flying a plane that had been tampered with in ways that wouldn't show up in a standard inspection? The answer depends on who you ask, and how much you're willing to believe. October 12th, 1997. Sunday afternoon. The The kind of coastal California day that makes people forget winter exists. Clear skies over Monterey Bay, temperature in the low 70s, winds calm at 5 knots. Perfect flying weather. Denver arrived at the airport around 2 in the afternoon. He was alone. No passengers, no co-pilot, just him and the Long-EZ. He'd told friends he wanted to do a solo inspection flight, get a feel for the plane's handling over water, maybe practice some maneuvers before taking it on longer trips. The flight plan was simple. Take off from Monterey Peninsula Airport, fly north along the coastline, circle back over Pacific Grove, land within the hour. Nothing ambitious, nothing that should have gone wrong. He completed his pre-flight checklist at 2:15. Walked around the aircraft, checked the control surfaces, verified fuel levels in both tanks. 5 gallons in the left tank, enough for about 30 minutes of flight time. The right tank held more, but the selector valve, that problematic valve behind his shoulder, was set to draw from the left. Standard procedure would be to start on one tank, switch to the other mid-flight to balance the fuel burn. Denver knew this. He'd done it hundreds of times in other aircraft. Witnesses at the airport later said he seemed normal, focused but not anxious. He spoke briefly with another pilot in the hangar, made a joke about the weather being too nice to waste, then climbed into the cockpit. The Long-EZ's canopy closed with a soft click. Engine start at 2:28. The Lycoming engine caught on the second try, propellers spinning up behind him with that distinctive pusher configuration sound. Tower cleared him for takeoff at 2:33. Rebecca, an aeronautical engineer who'd been watching from the observation area that day, remembered the takeoff. She'd flown in Long-EZ aircraft before, knew their characteristics, their quirks. It looked clean, she said years later in a letter to the NTSB. Normal rotation, good climb angle. Nothing about that takeoff suggested mechanical problems. She watched the plane bank north over the water, following the coastline toward Pacific Grove. Then she went back to her car. She didn't see what happened next. Denver flew north for approximately 23 minutes. Radio contact with the tower was routine. He reported his position twice, acknowledged traffic advisories, sounded calm and in control. At 2:56, he radioed that he was beginning his turn back toward the airport. That was the last transmission anyone heard from him. What happened in the next 2 minutes is where the story fractures into official narrative and persistent doubt. According to the National Transportation Safety Board's final report, issued 14 months after the crash, the sequence went like this. Denver's left fuel tank ran dry. The engine lost power. He attempted to switch to the right tank using the poorly positioned selector valve. In doing so, he either couldn't reach it properly or accidentally pushed the right rudder pedal while stretching back. The plane entered an uncontrolled roll. Altitude was too low for recovery. Impact occurred at 3:28 in the afternoon, approximately 150 yards offshore from Pacific Grove. But the details that didn't make it into the headlines told a different story, or at least raised questions the official report seemed eager to dismiss. Start with the witnesses on the beach. 11 people saw the plane go down. 7 of them, in separate statements given to local police within hours of the crash, mentioned hearing engine trouble before the dive. Not engine failure, engine trouble, sputtering. Irregular sounds. The kind of noises that suggest something more complex than simple fuel starvation. Then there's the wreckage itself. The Long-EZ hit the water in a near-vertical descent, nose first, at approximately 120 miles per hour. The impact shattered the composite fuselage into hundreds of pieces. Coast Guard divers recovered Denver's body within 20 minutes. He was still strapped into his seat, impact trauma consistent with high-speed collision. The engine, however, told a stranger story. When investigators pulled it from the water 3 days later, they found the fuel selector valve in the off position. Not left tank, not right tank, Off. Completely shut. How does a pilot, trying desperately to switch fuel sources, accidentally turn the valve to the one position that guarantees engine failure? The NTSB's answer was simple: panic, disorientation. Denver had never practiced this emergency in this specific aircraft. Under stress, he made the wrong move. Tragic, but understandable. Travis, the mechanic who'd inspected the plane 2 days earlier, didn't buy it. He'd worked on aircraft for 31 years, seen plenty of crashes, read plenty of reports. When he reviewed the findings, something bothered him. Those scratches around the fuel valve housing. The ones he'd documented. The NTSB report mentioned them in a single sentence. Evidence of recent amateur modification attempts noted on fuel system components. That was it. No follow-up. No investigation into what those modifications might have been, or whether they could have contributed to mechanical failure. Travis tried calling the lead investigator in January of 1998. Left 4 messages. Never got a response. He wrote a letter to the NTSB suggesting they examine whether the valve mechanism itself had been compromised. No reply. Eventually, he stopped trying. But he kept his inspection notes. Kept them in a file folder in his garage, next to 3 decades worth of other maintenance records. Just in case someone ever asked the right questions. The media coverage lasted about a week. John Denver, beloved singer, dies in plane crash. Most of the stories focused on his music career, his environmental work, his 2 ex-wives and 3 children. A few mentioned his passion for flying. Almost none dug into the technical details of the accident. Why would they? The NTSB had spoken. Pilot error. Case closed. Move on. But on the early internet, in the aviation forums and conspiracy theory message boards that were just beginning to proliferate in the late 90s, a different conversation was starting. People who knew planes, people who understood fuel systems, people who'd read the preliminary reports and noticed the gaps, they weren't satisfied. They started comparing notes, sharing documents, building timelines. And slowly, quietly, a question began to form. What if this wasn't an accident at all? The National Transportation Safety Board opened their investigation on October 13th, less than 24 hours after the crash. Standard procedure for any fatal aviation accident. A team of 4 investigators arrived in Monterey, led by a senior air safety inspector named George Pedersen. They had jurisdiction. They had resources. They had decades of combined experience analyzing wreckage and reconstructing final moments. What they also had, according to people who watched the investigation unfold, was a predetermined conclusion they seemed reluctant to deviate from. The official investigation lasted 14 months. The final report ran to 83 pages, including technical diagrams of the Long-EZ's fuel system, witness statements, metallurgical analysis of engine components, and a detailed timeline of Denver's final flight. The conclusion was unambiguous. Probable cause of the accident was the pilot's inability to maintain control of the aircraft during an attempted emergency fuel tank switch, complicated by the unconventional placement of the fuel selector valve, and Denver's unfamiliarity with the specific emergency procedures required for this aircraft type. Contributing factors included the builder's decision to place critical controls in ergonomically challenging positions. Recommendation: home-built aircraft should be subject to stricter oversight regarding control placement and accessibility. Clean, technical, definitive, and according to a small but vocal group of aviation professionals, incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. Rebecca was one of the first to go public with concerns. She'd spent 37 years as an aeronautical engineer, 12 of those working directly with composite aircraft design. She knew Long-EZ planes. She'd even consulted on fuel system layouts for experimental aircraft builders. When she read the NTSB report in January of 1999, She wrote a detailed letter to the lead investigator pointing out what she considered critical oversights. Her primary objection centered on the fuel valve position. Yes, it was awkwardly placed. Yes, it required the pilot to reach behind and twist without visual confirmation. But the NTSB had concluded that Denver, while attempting this maneuver in flight, had either moved the valve to the off position accidentally or had pushed the rudder pedal while stretching, causing the fatal roll. Rebecca's question was simple. Why didn't the report address the valve's mechanical condition? The scratches Travis had documented suggested someone had been manipulating or modifying the mechanism shortly before the flight. Had the valve been tested to ensure it moved smoothly through all positions? Had anyone checked whether it might stick or require excessive force? Could a malfunction in the valve itself have caused it to move to the off position without pilot input? She sent her letter certified mail, included copies of her credentials, technical drawings showing alternative fuel system configurations, and specific questions she believed the investigation should have answered. She received a response 6 weeks later, 2 paragraphs thanking her for her input and assuring her that all relevant mechanical factors had been thoroughly examined. No specific answers to her technical questions. No invitation to review additional data. Just polite dismissal wrapped in bureaucratic language. Rebecca wasn't the only one noticing gaps. Marcus, who'd known Denver for 16 years and had flown with him more times than he could count, had a different set of concerns. Marcus wasn't an engineer. He was a financial analyst who flew recreationally, someone who understood risk assessment and pattern recognition, and he saw patterns in the investigation that bothered him, like the maintenance records that went missing. Denver had kept meticulous logs of every flight, every inspection, every mechanical adjustment made to his aircraft over the years. Standard practice for any serious pilot. Those logs should have been in his hangar office, filed chronologically in 3-ring binders. Marcus knew because he'd seen Denver updating them dozens of times. When the NTSB requested the maintenance records for the Long-EZ in November of 1997, only partial documentation could be located. The logs covering the 3 months immediately before the crash, the period when Denver had owned the plane and presumably would have been documenting his familiarization flights and any modifications he was attempting, those were gone. The NTSB report mentioned this briefly. Complete maintenance logs prior to current owner's purchase were available. Recent logs could not be located and may have been lost in the accident or kept in a secondary location not yet identified. Marcus found that explanation ridiculous. Denver didn't keep backup logs. He kept one set, in his office, in labeled binders. Marcus had been in that office 4 days after the crash, helping Denver's family sort through personal effects. The binders were there. He'd seen them. By the time the NTSB formally requested them 3 weeks later, they'd vanished. He tried to raise this with the investigators, made phone calls, sent emails, got the same treatment Rebecca got. Thank you for your concern. Everything relevant has been examined. We appreciate your cooperation. But no real answers. No explanation for how critical documentation disappeared from a secured location during an active federal investigation. Eventually, Marcus did what Rebecca did. He gave up trying to work within official channels and started looking for other people who weren't satisfied with the official story. The media, meanwhile, had moved on completely. By the spring of 1998, John Denver was old news. The occasional retrospective article about his music career, a tribute concert here and there, but nothing about the investigation. Nothing questioning the findings. The narrative had solidified. Beloved folk singer, experienced pilot, tragic accident caused by poor judgment and bad aircraft design. A cautionary tale about the dangers of experimental aviation. What made this narrative so easy to accept was how it fit existing biases. People wanted to believe that accidents happen because of mistakes, not malice. that investigations are thorough and honest, that federal agencies have no reason to hide information or rush to conclusions. And besides, what was the alternative? That someone deliberately sabotaged John Denver's plane? Why? Who would benefit from killing a 53-year-old singer whose commercial peak was 20 years behind him? Those questions would take years to develop answers, or at least theories that resembled answers. But even in those first months after the crash, before the conspiracy theories really took hold, there were people like Rebecca and Marcus and Travis who looked at the official report and felt something fundamental was wrong. Not because they had proof of sabotage or cover-up, but because they knew what thorough investigations looked like, and this wasn't one. The NTSB closed the case in December of 1998. Probable cause determined, recommendations issued, file archived. As far as the federal government was concerned, there was nothing more to discuss about John Denver's death. He'd made a fatal error in a poorly designed aircraft, and the consequences had been predictable and tragic. End of story. Except stories don't end just because officials say they do, especially when the people closest to those stories refuse to stop asking questions. The internet in the late 90s was a different animal than it is now. No social media, no YouTube, no algorithmic feeds pushing content at you. Just message boards and forums where people with specific interests gathered to share information that mainstream outlets ignored. And in the aviation forums, in the conspiracy theory corners of the early web, John Denver's death became a case study in unanswered questions. The first theory to gain traction focused on his environmental activism. Denver had spent the final years of his life becoming increasingly vocal about corporate destruction of natural habitats. He'd testified before Congress in 1993 about the importance of protecting the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge from oil exploration. He'd campaigned against offshore drilling along the California coast. He'd used his fame, what was left of it, to draw attention to causes that made him enemies in powerful places. And in September of 1997, just 3 weeks before his death, he'd appeared at a rally in Santa Barbara opposing new offshore drilling permits that several major petroleum companies were seeking. The rally hadn't gotten much national coverage. Local news ran a few minutes of footage showing Denver speaking to a crowd of about 200 people. But what he said that day stuck with people who were paying attention. He didn't just oppose the drilling on environmental grounds. He specifically called out 3 companies by name, accused them of falsifying environmental impact studies, suggested that federal regulators had been compromised by industry lobbying. Strong words. The kind of accusations that, if they gained momentum, could cost those companies millions in delayed permits and public relations damage. 2 of those companies had connections to individuals who later appeared peripherally in the investigation of Denver's crash. Not direct connections. Nothing provable. But the kind of 6 degrees of separation links that make conspiracy theorists lean forward in their chairs. One company's head of government relations had a brother who worked as a contract mechanic at several small airports in California, including Monterey Peninsula. Another company's legal counsel had previously represented a manufacturer of experimental aircraft components. Thin threads. Maybe meaningless. Or maybe exactly the kind of plausibly deniable connections that people with resources use when they need something done quietly. The problem with this theory, the reason it never moved beyond internet speculation into serious investigative journalism, was motive. Yes, Denver had annoyed some petroleum executives, but was he really threatening enough to justify murder? He wasn't leading a massive movement. He wasn't about to expose criminal activity. He was a former pop star speaking at a small rally. Killing him would draw more attention to his message than ignoring him ever would. Unless, some people argued, the point wasn't to silence his message. The point was to send a message to other celebrities who might be considering similar activism. Make an example. Make it look like an accident. Let the fear do the rest. The second major theory focused on insurance. Denver had updated his life insurance policy in June of 1997. Increased the coverage from $2 million to $4 million. Standard procedure, some said, for someone in his financial position. But the timing bothered people. 4 months before his death, he doubles his coverage. Then he dies in a way that triggers full payout because it's ruled accidental rather than suicide. His estate receives $4 million. His ex-wives, his children, they all benefit substantially. Not enough to suggest they were involved, but enough to make investigators wonder whether someone else might have known about that policy change and seen an opportunity. This theory had even less evidence than the environmental activism angle. No forensic accountant ever found suspicious transactions in Denver's financial records. No one could point to anyone in his life who desperately needed money badly enough to kill for it. And Denver himself had been the one to increase the coverage, acting on advice from his financial advisor who'd recommended it based on changing estate tax laws. Nothing sinister about updating your insurance when you're in your 50s and thinking about legacy planning. But still, $4 million. 4 months before death. The timing made people uncomfortable. The third theory, the one that wouldn't fully emerge until years later, came from a journalist named Diane. She'd been working on a book about unsolved aviation mysteries in the early 2000s when she decided to include a chapter on Denver's crash. Her research started with the standard sources, NTSB reports, and news archives, but then she started digging into the peripheral players. The people who'd worked at the Monterey Airport in 1997. The mechanics, the hangar staff, the fuel truck drivers. Most of them were exactly what they appeared to be. Working-class people doing ordinary jobs. But one name kept appearing in contexts that seemed odd. His name was Alan. He'd worked part-time doing basic maintenance on privately owned aircraft, mostly cleaning and minor repairs. Nothing that required certification. He'd been working at Monterey Peninsula Airport for about 8 months before Denver's crash. Left his job 2 weeks after the accident. Told his supervisor he was moving back east to be closer to family. Standard enough story. Except Diane found out that Alan's previous employment, before he showed up in Monterey, had been with a defense contractor in Nevada. Specifically, a company that did maintenance work on military aircraft at Nellis Air Force Base. Why would someone with that kind of background take a low-paying part-time job doing basic hangar work at a civilian airport? Diane couldn't answer that question. She tried tracking Alan down, found an address in Virginia, sent letters. No response. She tried calling. Number disconnected. She even flew to Virginia in 2004, knocked on the door of the address she'd found. House was empty, for sale sign in the yard. Neighbors said the previous owner had moved out 6 months earlier, didn't know where he'd gone. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe Alan was just a guy who'd worked various aviation jobs and happened to be in Monterey when a celebrity died nearby. But Diane included what she'd found in her book, published in 2006. And the online communities that had been discussing Denver's death for years seized on it immediately. Here was a person with military connections, working at the exact airport where Denver kept his plane, leaving town right after the crash. It wasn't proof, but it was the kind of detail that made the sabotage theory feel less crazy. The forums where these theories circulated were small, a few hundred regular participants at most. They shared documents, compared notes, built elaborate timelines connecting Denver's activism to his insurance policy to Alan's mysterious background. Some of it was solid research. Most of it was speculation built on speculation. But what united everyone in these communities was a fundamental distrust of the official narrative. They'd seen too many investigations that seemed designed to reach predetermined conclusions. They'd watched too many inconvenient questions get ignored or dismissed. And maybe they were right to be skeptical. Or maybe they were just people who couldn't accept that sometimes accidents are exactly what they appear to be. That a talented, experienced pilot can make a fatal error. That poor aircraft design can kill you no matter how many hours you've logged. That tragedy doesn't always have a hidden villain behind it. The problem with conspiracy theories isn't that they're always wrong, it's that they're unfalsifiable. Every piece of missing evidence becomes proof of cover-up. Every official denial becomes confirmation of guilt. Every coincidence becomes connection. And once you start seeing patterns, once you convince yourself that powerful people are hiding the truth, there's no amount of evidence that can change your mind. Because the absence of evidence just means they're really good at hiding it. Still, 27 years later, people are still talking about John Denver's crash, still pointing out the inconsistencies, still wondering why certain questions never got answered. And maybe that persistence means something. Or maybe it just means we're uncomfortable with randomness. With the idea that someone can be alive and flying on a beautiful Sunday afternoon, and then gone 2 minutes later for no reason more profound than being in the wrong place, with the wrong equipment, at the wrong moment. The Federal Aviation Administration changed their regulations in 1999. New requirements for home-built aircraft, specifically regarding control placement and accessibility during flight. The rule became known informally as the Denver Amendment, though no one at the FAA ever called it that officially. Critical flight controls, including fuel selectors, had to be positioned within easy reach of the pilot, clearly marked, and operable without requiring the pilot to remove their hands from primary flight controls or significantly shift body position. Experimental aircraft builders who wanted certification had to retrofit existing planes or demonstrate that their designs met the new standards. It was a reasonable regulation, one that probably should have existed years earlier. But for people like Rebecca and Marcus, people who'd spent years questioning the official investigation, the new rule felt like an admission of something the NTSB had never quite said out loud: that Denver's crash had been preventable, that the aircraft design was fundamentally flawed, that even an experienced pilot couldn't be expected to safely operate a plane where life-or-death decisions required contortionist flexibility and blind faith that your hand would find the right switch in an emergency. Denver's family never publicly accepted the NTSB's conclusion. His brother Ronald, in a television interview in 2001, said the family had significant concerns about the investigation's completeness. He didn't elaborate, didn't point fingers or name conspiracies, just made it clear that they didn't believe all the questions had been answered. Denver's children rarely spoke about their father's death to media, but when they did, the subtext was always the same. This wasn't closure. This was an ending that didn't feel like the truth. The crash site itself became a quiet memorial. No official marker, nothing sanctioned by the city or state. Just a spot off the Pacific Grove coast where people who loved Denver's music would sometimes kayak out and leave flowers tied to a buoy. The flowers would sink after a few days, but new ones would appear. Year after year. A rotation of grief and remembrance maintained by strangers who felt connected to someone they'd never met. In 2015, a documentary filmmaker named Kevin decided to revisit the case. He'd been working on a series about celebrity deaths that deserved second looks, cases where official explanations seemed incomplete or suspicious. He spent 8 months researching Denver's crash, interviewed Rebecca and Marcus, tried to track down Travis, the mechanic who'd since retired and moved to Oregon. He submitted Freedom of Information Act requests for documents related to the investigation, requested interviews with former NTSB investigators, tried to get access to the archived physical evidence, the pieces of wreckage that had been stored in a federal facility in Southern California. Every door closed in his face. The FOIA requests returned heavily redacted documents or delays citing national security concerns, which made no sense for a civilian aircraft accident. Former investigators either didn't respond to interview requests or responded through lawyers telling Kevin to cease contact. The facility where the wreckage was supposedly stored claimed they had no record of Denver's aircraft components, suggested they'd been disposed of per standard protocol years earlier. No documentation of the disposal, no record of who authorized it. Just gone. Kevin managed to film about 40 hours of interview footage, collected copies of documents from private sources, built a compelling argument that the investigation had been inadequate at minimum and possibly deliberately compromised. But he couldn't get distribution. Every streaming service, every cable network he approached passed on the project. Too controversial, they said. Too speculative. Not enough hard evidence. Legal departments worried about defamation liability. One executive told him off the record that there were people who didn't want this story told, and that Kevin should consider whether this was the hill he wanted to die on professionally. He released a 15-minute version on YouTube in 2016. It got 37,000 views before being taken down for unspecified copyright violations. He appealed. The appeal was denied. The footage exists somewhere, probably on a hard drive in Kevin's office, but it's never been publicly available since. The online communities that had been discussing Denver's death since the late 90s are mostly gone now. Forums shut down, websites disappeared, participants moved on or died or just got tired of asking questions that would never be answered. But every few years, someone new discovers the story, reads the NTSB report, notices the gaps, starts posting questions on Reddit or wherever people gather to discuss unsolved mysteries. And the cycle begins again. The same evidence gets examined. The same theories get proposed. The same frustration builds when people realize how many loose ends were never tied. Travis still has his inspection notes. He's 81 now, living in a retirement community in Oregon, but he kept those files, showed them to Kevin when the documentary filmmaker came calling, said he'd testify if anyone ever reopened the investigation, though he doubted anyone would. "I've seen a lot of crashes," Travis told Kevin on camera. "Some are genuine accidents, pure bad luck or pilot error. Some are mechanical failures nobody could have predicted. And some, not many but some, make you wonder if what you're looking at is what really happened. This one made me wonder." Rebecca died in 2019. Lung cancer unrelated to anything involving John Denver. She'd spent the last 20 years of her life as an aviation safety consultant, helped redesign fuel systems for experimental aircraft, probably saved lives with her work. But she never stopped believing that Denver's investigation had been incomplete. Left behind dozens of letters she'd written to various officials over the years, all politely ignored, all filed away in boxes her family found after her death. Marcus is still alive, still flies recreationally, still thinks about his friend who died doing something they both loved. He doesn't talk about conspiracy theories anymore, doesn't post on forums or give interviews. But sometimes, when he's flying alone over the California coast, he'll pass near Pacific Grove and think about that Sunday afternoon in October. Think about how quickly things can change, how someone can be here and then gone, and how the official explanation never quite captures the complexity of what was lost. John Denver's music still plays. Country stations, oldies formats, that specific subset of classic rock that encompasses folk and soft pop from the 70s. New generations discover "Take Me Home, Country Roads" and Annie's Song and Rocky Mountain High, and have no idea about the controversy surrounding his death. To them, he's just a voice from their parents' or grandparents' era, singing about simpler times and beautiful places. The mystery, the unanswered questions, the theories and suspicions, all of that exists in a separate space that most people never encounter. Was John Denver murdered? Was his plane sabotaged by people he'd angered with his activism? Did someone with military connections tamper with his fuel system, in a way that would look like pilot error? Or was it exactly what the NTSB said? A tragic accident caused by poor design and a moment of panic? 27 years later, we still don't know. Maybe we never will. The evidence that might have provided answers is gone or locked away. The people who could speak definitively are silent or dead. The investigation is closed. The case is settled. The official story is written. But the questions remain, hanging in the air like those flowers tied to a buoy off the Pacific Grove coast, sinking slowly, always replaced by new ones, because some stories refuse to end just because someone declares them over. Some deaths leave shadows that facts can't quite illuminate. And sometimes, the truth is less important than the fact that people still care enough to keep asking for it. You decide what you believe: the pilot who made a fatal mistake, or the inconvenient activist who died at a very convenient time. The flawed aircraft that betrayed its operator, or the carefully arranged accident that was meant to look exactly like that. The complete investigation that answered every relevant question, or the cover-up that left deliberate gaps for plausible deniability. All the evidence you need to support any of those conclusions is there, or isn't there, depending on what you're willing to see. John Denver died on October 12, 1997. Everything else is interpretation.